My name is Brad Pragnell, and I'm a consultant with Payments Canada. Because of the time zone challenges for our panel, this session is being pre-recorded. However, we will be using the chat function, and that will be available for the making of questions during the day. But before we start our session, let's do some introductions. We'll go in alphabetical order, and we might start with Martin. So Martin, could you introduce yourself with your name, title, and organization?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. My name is Martin Grunewald. I'm from BankservAfrica in South Africa, and I'm the Chief Business Officer.
Katrina?
Thanks, Brad. My name is Katrina Stuart, and I'm Managing Director for New Payments Platform Australia.
And Jenny?
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. My name is Jenny Winther, and I am the Secretary General heading the Nordic Payments Council, the NPC, joining you from Stockholm.
Great. Thank you very much. And yeah, we are a bit of around the world here. So myself and Katrina are here in Sydney, Australia. Martin is in South Africa, and Jenny is dialing in from Sweden. So yes, definitely an around the world session today. I'd like to just have a little bit of a brief discussion around each of the systems that you're involved with. So maybe if you can briefly describe real-time payment system that you're most directly involved with, then I might just start with Katrina. Maybe you can describe for our attendees today a little bit about the new payments platform.
Sure, thanks, Brad. So the new payments platform's been operational for about 4 years here in Australia, and it was intentionally designed to be a fast, flexible and data-rich account-to-account payment system that was really meant to support a modern digital economy. It supports a whole range of different payments, so whether it's for paying friends or family, used for B2C payments, so things like on-demand pay or paying a taxi driver at the end of a shift. It's been used for a range of C2B payments, increasingly by small businesses are using it as a way to accept payments from customers, and particularly during COVID times as well, when people have had to pivot to digital payments. And also by the government as well, increasingly being used for things like disaster relief payments, or also for COVID payments as well. So that's who we are.
Great, thanks. And maybe Martin, if you can describe a bit of the system that you're most involved with at the moment, the real-time system.
Yeah, we're right in the midst of what Katrina probably went through a few years ago. So we in the stage of actually deploying. We're in testing, hoping to go live later this year. So the real-time platform in the South African context is more around micro payments and low value, and really trying to look at filling that gap of financial inclusion. So I think that's more or less what we'll chat about today, is how that's working from a South African context.
Great. And Jenny?
Yes, so I'm heading what is called the Nordic Payments Council, meaning that we are responsible for payment schemes. So this is a large initiative in the Nordics, trying to harmonize and simplify payments based on the ISO standard, and also simplify towards the Eurozone. So what I'm doing is for Norwegian krona, Danish krona, and Swedish krona. So we are setting the rules, meaning business and operational rules, as well as the formats for instant payments going forward in the Nordics. This is yet to be implemented. We have just started. But I also have a former experience, so to speak, in instant payments, because I used to be working at the main clearinghouse in Sweden, and was responsible when we launched the first peer-to-peer payment products in Sweden called Swish in 2012. So it has up and running now for 10 years. And it was one of the world's first actually real-time payment app or wallet with all the settlement, everything in real time. And it's proven to be a huge success. So we are now having 8 out of 9 million using the service. Started out as micropayments, as Martin said, peer-to-peer, moved into e-commerce, moving into physical stores now. It's a preferred payment method. You pay more with Swish than with cash in Sweden today. So it's literally changed the way of paying in our country. So the experience from that has been vast and huge, actually, and really interesting. And now we are sort of going into the second phase and see how to do cross-border, actually. I think that will be the new challenge for us, having a lot of different currencies to deal with in our close environment.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's definitely going to be some of the future challenges, and we'll be talking a little bit about that a bit later in the session. I think just picking up on what you said, Jenny, about we've had Swish has been around for nearly a decade. You go back and probably the first modern real-time payment system probably would have been UK Faster Payments, which began, back around 2008, I believe it was, 2007. So you go back and so, you're getting on almost 10, 15 years of experience now. So I guess really the issue is looking back over that decade or so, and I might just start with Katrina. What have we learned? What have we learned around the adoption of real-time payment systems and around the use cases? I know that when real-time systems are established, there's a lot of questions, particularly from industry around, well, who's going to use this? What is it going to be used for? Particularly when you're looking at developed markets where card and other payment systems are relatively mature. What do you think's been that experience over the past 10 years or so? And I might just start with Katrina. What have we learned over this period?
I think certainly when we were designing the MPP, we looked elsewhere to see what could we learn from a kind of infrastructure perspective. And one of the key areas was looking about how you can actually have broad, scalable infrastructure. When we first went live in Australia with the MPP, there was a big focus on initially retail banking accounts and how do we ensure that we've got broad reach across those for people who can make and receive MPP payments. And also the banks basically took a decision to basically automatically shift a lot of that volume over to the MPP. So actually, as a customer, if I go to my banking channel to make a payment, I'm not necessarily making a choice. So I'm not having to drive any customer behavioural change. The banks just basically said, I'm going to move it onto a different set of rails. And that's what I'm going to use to deliver that customer experience. And then what we found is that once people sort of understood that actually now my payment is going to go through in real time and the person I'm sending money to is going to receive that quickly, that's actually created a velocity of payments as well. So actually people are using it more frequently. So we always thought we would see some migration from the sort of legacy system. And we've seen some of that, but what we've also seen is a kind of a rapid acceleration of the number of payments as well on the MPP. And that's coming from displacing other payment types, so cash to some extent, also credit cards, as people choose to use it as their preferred payment option. And I think sort of once you've got that sort of broad customer reach from a retail banking perspective, we're now moving more into kind of corporate and B2B payments as well. And now working with industry and corporate customers to say, how do we move some of that volume over to the MPP as well? And our focus is very much about how do we continue to build out the platform from a functionality perspective to continue to drive that usage and that adoption. But I think that initial kind of how do you kind of get a change in behaviour or a change in how people do pay is that first critical thing.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of leads me to Jenny. So Jenny, you touched upon the adoption of Swish and how it's been rapidly taken up. And in many ways, I think the experience in Sweden and the Nordics has been, that quite carefully. So what do you think we've learned over the past 10 years about what works and what doesn't work, and particularly around adoption and around use cases?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of good things that Katrina mentioned. The question about reach is one, and that comes back then to collaboration, probably having an infrastructure that is shared by a lot of players so that you can create the reach to start with. I think it's really important. But I also think there must be some kind of market need. And in the case in Sweden, and this might be different from different geographies, but at that point in time, we were not using cash very much. We were large credit card or card users. And that ended up being a problem because you couldn't pay with cards to your friend and nobody really carried the cash anymore. Hence, the P2P experience to start in that way was really good because that actually meant that there was a driver from the users. So we started. We could start in different angles, but here we started on the consumer level. And also, I think keywords here is collaboration. You need to have a lot of actors involved and collaborate. It will never work with just one bank having one real-time offer. You need to have the critical mass, and that's what has been built up through some years now in having all the consumers using it and now being a preferred channel. So it has then eventually gone into actually taking out credit card. At first, we didn't see any changes in all the other usual payments. It was just replacing cash and actually more payments altogether in the area. And now we have seen that it's credit card or card payments that it's sort of taking on. But I think to the largest, just payments adding. And then, of course, moving into e-commerce, we also saw, of course, a drive during the pandemic, well suited for that. And then it moved into the elder generation, which hadn't really been reached at that point in time. But it was a really good way of paying remotely, of course. So I think common infrastructure, and sometimes there is always discussion how much should sort of governmental or legal people or legacy drive. And I think it could help at some point in time, and depending on geography. But I think the best services come out of need and come out of collaboration, because you want to actually solve something or do something going forward. And I also think for generally in the market today, people are expecting real time. And when understanding, as you said, Katrina, you get the money in real time, that's when people start using it for all kinds of things, actually.
Yeah. So Martin, just picking up, I mean, you mentioned earlier financial inclusion. So, and you're very much, getting towards the sort of in the midst of your project and looking at delivering it soon. So in terms of the work that BankservAfrica did with your various stakeholders, what did you learn from other deployments in terms of thinking about use cases, thinking about getting that adoption up, particularly given that South Africa and Southern Africa is has some different dynamics and different market conditions than other parts of the world?
Yeah, Brad, I think what is interesting about what both Jenny and Katrina are saying, it's the evolutionary process of real-time payments that I think we sometimes underestimate. South Africa, as an example, was the second country in the world to put a real-time solution down early on, and it just went nowhere and died a death almost, because it only catered for one use case, and that was sort of a more high-value payment. You go and buy a car and you want to pay immediately. So it ended up being a high-cost solution for the consumer, and it just never got wheels. And I think when we had to start re-looking at what we do in South Africa and start looking at a low-cost solution, high volume, low value, we actually spent time in India and in China. We had a look at those various examples. I think there's a lot of similarities on what we're trying to build to the Indian model, actually. Maybe not as our regulators not as assertive as maybe the Indian one was, but I think we structured a lot around that, and again our lessons have been, and I think we've seen this in other implementations as well. The tech is almost the easy part. I think the hard part is getting consensus with your stakeholders, building out the solution. And so I think that storyline that we've seen so far of trying to get everyone on board and over the line has been important. What I think where we are now is you start now having a look at the challenges, as Jenny was saying, on where do you start? How do you evolve this? P2P payments quite easy. But then how do you start getting that acceptance out into the market and familiarity? So I think we've taken a few examples. We spent time actually in Australia as well. We met up with Katrina and chatted to her. So what is nice from a South African perspective is we don't have to reinvent everything. Is we can take learnings around the world, and then also solve for some of the African challenges where we've had massive closed loop solutions like M-Pesa that have dominated, and how do we start creating interoperability with that as well? So I think those have been our lessons in terms of being really careful what use cases you go with, and don't box yourself into a corner, and then understanding that this is evolutionary. And that it'll actually, the use cases will evolve, they'll migrate, and the volume goes with that.
Yeah. So, Martin, if I can just pick up on the point. So one of the things that we discussed previously, so organizations like the World Bank and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sort of see having a fast payment system as an important enabler of economic growth. So you mentioned India, I think, as a system that you looked at. So what kind of impact have we seen or should we expect in developing markets? Like, what is the gap that you can close and obviously South Africa is unique because it has both developed and developing markets, but what do you think is the marginal impact that you can have by implementing a real-time system?
Look, I think the real value, and you'll find that's why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is investing a lot of money as well, is the keys interoperability. So we've developed a lot of mobile type solutions, wallet solutions across the continent, and you see that in a lot of developing countries. But if you look at where the Gates Foundation started with their work in these countries, they've come to realize that the key is actually interoperability, and with that you can start creating that cross-border functionality as well. I think from an African perspective, and I think the two key things that we need to solve, one is the interoperability and starting to make the closed loops talk to each other, and the second is cross-border. How do we actually create instant payments across cross-border? We've got a very migrant type workforce, and it's similar to what you'd see with Mexico and America. People want to send a couple of $100. They don't want to send thousands home. And how do we make that cost-effective and immediate?
Yeah, no, that's very, very true, I think, in terms of meeting that market need. So, Jenny, you mentioned again, when you talked a bit about the Nordic experience, about the importance of P2P as sort of the starting point. So what do you think developed markets have learned from developing markets? So if you look at what's happened in places like Africa, and again, there's the example of things like M-Pesa, to what degree do you think that those developing market experiments and deployments impacted what happened in more developed markets in terms of thinking about real time and how they should be deployed?
Yes, I think the benefit for developing markets, if you can put it that way, is that they don't have all the technical legacy, all the old systems that we have. Yeah. We have been sort of having digital or technical system making payments in the 70s. So we have a lot of heritage and a lot of old systems. So you're sort of always struggling with that technical depth or depth, if you could put it that way. So I think, especially M-Pesa, that was really early on also understanding the importance of the handheld device and how you can actually now, with the technology we have now, skip whole generations of technology and move to just having phones and a telephone network working. So I think that is really good, and that's a good starting point for the developing countries. And I think also, from my perspective, I also hold the initiative in India very high, in the sense that it's sort of been all inclusive, thinking of all aspects of digital identity, getting people banked, getting hold of also cheap ways of paying. It's accessible. They have their Rupee card, which is also not too expensive to do, so that you actually can use the digital or electronic means of paying. So I think there's quite a lot to understand for also the movement of people. And I agree with you, Martin. I think this interoperability and cross-border payments, that's the thing to solve for all, the whole world, actually. We have the same things in our countries. We are very domestic in our ways of paying, actually.
Katrina, I might just come to you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts around what we can learn from developing markets. We are starting to explore a little bit around the whole issue around cross-border as well. And I know that NPP Australia has been involved in a number of cross-border pilots as well. So maybe you can talk a little bit about both, what we can learn or what NPPA has learned from developing market deployments, but also maybe talk a little bit about, what you've done in cross-border and where you see the future is in terms of cross-border payments for real-time systems and how they're connected.
Yeah. So I might start with the first around what we can learn from developing countries. So I think to Jenny's point, it's very much that acceleration towards digital payments. And I think, we've seen that, work quite successfully in a number of markets like India. And I think as we look at what's likely to happen, particularly from a kind of a customer perspective here in Australia, it's about how increasingly, payments are just going to get sort of embedded into other experiences, and it will be those broader digital experiences that are going to happen, and particularly with things like open banking and other developments that are happening in the market as well, that almost kind of the payment sort of disappears really from the whole kind of actual process. And I think it's about actually focusing on how do you actually create a really good, strong customer experience in the digital world, and what does that look like? And again, I think that's, where markets like India have done quite well. I think also it's about certainly huge opportunities, I think, particularly in the Australian market, from a kind of processing perspective as well, more on the B2B side. So I think actually moving from such legacy infrastructure in the way that people have done it for 40 years, there's actually huge improvements that we can see from a kind of process perspective, where you can integrate the payment into that kind of end-to-end process. So whether it's something like e-invoicing, or looking at how you can make sort of, a payroll payments more seamless, and, start to be able to support things like, the gig economy. It's really important, I think, from a payments perspective, and we see a lot of opportunity there. I think sort of cross-border is going to be sort of a case of, kind of when, not sort of if. I mean, I think, I think it was Martin's point. I think the technical piece is really easy. So, a couple of years ago, we did some pilots whereby there was actually money moving from, Singapore to Australia in about 18 seconds. And that was just really the easy part. The hard part is around the sort of the risk processes and the sanctions screening and AML, and how do you make sure that you've got kind of the right sort of governance in place, and kind of have that interoperability across different payment systems, which I think will take probably a little bit longer to kind of work through. But potentially maybe we'll start to see some kind of corridors in terms of, where there's high volume of traffic, and from a payments perspective, start to see some of that happen. I think already we're seeing around the world, more from a kind of regional perspective, sort of, markets that are in the same regional proximity are kind of getting together to work out how do you actually support that cross-border flow of funds.
Yeah, that might lead me to bring Jenny into the conversation here in terms of the regional work that you've been involved with. So again, maybe you can comment a little bit around the ability for regional initiatives to help facilitate cross-border, and talk a little bit about your experience in terms of what's happening between the Nordic countries.
Yes, so what we're doing, first of all, is and I agree with Katrina regarding, it's a lot about the governance and how to make this work from that perspective. So what we've been doing, and what I'm leading right now, is to make that kind of processes, the business rules, as well as the formats, to be the same in the three Nordic area, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, which do not have euros, but also very similar to the euro countries. so that we could easily exchange between those countries in forms of what information and how should it be handled and so forth. In parallel, they're also building, so there are also technical infrastructures like P27 being built that will do this cross, or sort of make all the technical implementation and processing payments in the different areas. In addition, also looking at the other side, the central banks, the Swedish central bank is now investigating together with the European Central Bank. And I think, Katrina, this is part of your sort of corridors, because we are interacting a lot with Europe, obviously, or with the Euro countries. They're looking into how to do cross-currency settlement, meaning that it's actually in the settlement part where money is exchanged. So it's actually, well, now we're really into the nerdy payment stuff. So that's how it could actually flow between the countries through the actual central banks, which is something completely new, and that's really interesting. And then I just want to add that I also so much agree with you, Katrina, regarding that payments as such should be sort of an integrating, seamless part of an experience. So we can nerd about exactly how it's done in the middle. I don't think that's an issue for the people using the payments. It should be a very integrated processing. It sort of, for the consumers, it sort of just should happen, and for the business to get the right information and the money as soon as possible. So I think that's important to point out, but it needs to be handled on the other side, and that's for us to work out.
Yeah, definitely. So Martin, just on that regional perspective and the cross-border piece, I know BankservAfrica is obviously based in South Africa, but you've played an important role within the region. And obviously South Africa is a very large and developed economy within Africa and within the Southern African region. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what the thinking is in terms of cross-border payments, and in terms of where you see that heading, where are the best opportunities for where you're taking this in the future.
I think just to start off with, or that you may or may not know, we actually the licensed clearinghouse for SADC. So it's actually our job to look at cross-border, but it hasn't been very easy. I think there's actually a solution that exists today that we've put in place. But again, as we've said, it's so much easier to put a solution down than to actually get everyone using it. Now, if you're familiar with this region, there's a lot of people that have done small fintech startups to deal with cross-border transactions, and they have somebody in one country and somebody else in the other country dishing out cash when it reaches there. Now, when you implement a cross-border solution in this environment, you're actually killing all those little businesses in a sense. So it's been actually slower than what we anticipated. We've got about 5 entities live and doing cross-border transactions, but I think it's something we have to crack, because as you said, we can nerd out a little bit in the center on how this all works, but the point is it's expensive for people. And so we've got to bring the price point of these cross-border transactions down, and so we almost see it as a task to do on behalf of the communities more than anything else. So the bottom line, Brad, is that there is a cross-border solution down. It's slow. And it's also settles in Rand at the moment, which isn't always great as well. So I was interested to hear around how people are trying to solve cross-border and multi-currency. So I'll probably be calling on Jenny sometime to have a chat to her. But I think people are even looking at various sort of crypto settlement options as well, and how could that work? So it's a bit of a journey. Yet again, it's about getting people to work together to solve some of these problems.
Yeah. I just want to go back to you, Jenny, for a sec. You started to touch about sort of the ecosystem enablers. So what do you think are the ecosystem enablers that allow a fast payment system to succeed? You kind of mentioned digital identity, but what is your thinking around digital identity and other things like open banking and the regulatory environment? How important are those for ensuring the success of a fast payments system that's being deployed?
Yes, well, first of all, I think just to repeat myself, I think digital identity, you need to have some means of actually authenticate the ones making the payment, of course. So that has to be there. And that's also why I mentioned India, because they were also very early on in understanding this. And then it's a bit difficult to say exactly how I always say that the stars align somehow when you actually get those systems really used, and why does it happen? So from the experience that we have going back, and now since it was a peer-to-peer system, we needed to have actually the easy thing or strange thing, trust in the system, trust in technology, quite high technology maturity, that you also have the access to devices and stuff that were coming in at that point in time, and people were starting getting used to it. So those were some of the aspects. And I come back to that you need to have quite a large cooperation. We had our central bank very involved in how to supporting the settlement. There were all of the major banks working together, technology providers. So it needs to be quite a big initiative in that sense. And coming back to what you talk about, Martin, you have to have quite a broad agreement in making this happen. And particularly then if we want to move on going cross-border, you need to start having those things too. And then I'm not sure if that will always be the case, but we started quite small, and then the use cases sort of evolved, and we were looking at now, as you say, Katrina, I think business to business and payment versus delivery, and those kind of use cases are now evolving. But we also came from a quite advanced in the sense payment infrastructure, so there wasn't a big problem for the corporates, but I think getting more used to real-time payments, that's where we're going now, and also to connect it with all kinds of information. So the request to pay or something where we're getting all the information already from the ones wanting to be paid, so that is in an entire ecosystem working together, I think is important.
Thanks. That leads me to Katrina. Katrina, I think one of the things that we've seen with NPP is that you've continued to innovate. It wasn't just a matter of the deployment, back a few years ago. You've continued to enhance it. I think one of the major enhancements you have coming up is the new Pay2 service, and I know you're continuing to think about how to enhance what NPP offers. So maybe you can explain a little bit about just briefly about the Pay2 service, and maybe your thinkings around, what are the new forms of features and functionalities that you think real-time systems will be delivering over the next, say, 5 to 10 years? So where are these systems going to be continually enhanced?
Thanks, Brad. So, I think certainly what we've found since the NPP went live is when you've got just basically a credit transfer payment in terms of as a customer, I'm pushing a payment out of my bank account, that can be a little bit sort of limited in terms of the use cases you can actually use it for. And what we've done over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, really, because even before the platform went live, is talk to industry about how do we actually develop broad capability that will support a third party being able to initiate a payment from a customer's bank account with their authorization. And that's what we're looking to go live with this year, which is our Pay2 service. So it kind of started off initially very much as looking at how do you create a better digital alternative for recurring payments. Particularly here in Australia, that has a number of pain points in terms of I can set up a direct debit payment, but then it's very hard for me to cancel it or even remember where it is. And if I need to make any change to it, that's quite an arduous process. But as we kind of looked at that capability, we kind of realised quite quickly that actually if we're going to go and get the whole industry across, over 100 organisations to implement capability and make changes in their own operating environments, that we needed to make it really broad and scalable, that it'll support a whole range of different use cases. So we ended up developing a service that will support broad payment initiation, whether that's, to support e-commerce, whereby I want to set up my bank account on file and use that for my, Amazon purchases, or the in-app payments, being able to use my bank account as my funding source, or even at point of sale together with QR codes as well. And also supporting corporate payments. So I can, authorize an intermediary to make payments on my behalf. So we kind of recognised it was really important to really make it broad. And I think it's that's what's really exciting about it as well, because we've thought about half a dozen use cases, but already even before we go live, there are already people out there talking about different use cases that we hadn't even thought about. So we think it really will be sort of transformational, because it just really opens up what a whole broader ecosystem can actually do with the real-time payments capability. So I think, that's really exciting. I think sort of going forward, we're also looking at things like how do we support, inbound cross-border payments? How do we start to do more with the messaging capability as well that we have on the MPP? So the MPP having been built on the ISO 20022 message schema, there's a lot from a data perspective, and we're only just starting to scratch the surface there in terms of how do we start to bring some of that to life. And I think that's where we'll probably see some future innovation and developments as we move forward. And I think really when you particularly get into more that sort of business and corporate payment area, you start to have a whole broader ecosystem with various, software providers or intermediaries or payment service providers that have got a really important role to play. And that's actually where we're seeing quite a lot of the innovation happen as well, in terms of what they're doing with the real-time capability together with APIs and kind of some of the payment services and solutions that they're developing for the marketplace.
Yeah. Martin, I might just throw to you next. In terms of your thinking around the future developments, I know you're still at, you're still at Go Live coming up. What's your thinking about future enhancements, about road mapping and continuing to improve your offering? So what are your thoughts in terms of what that journey is going to look like?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking, how do I follow up what Katrina just said? I think she nailed it.
It's pretty impressive, isn't it?
I think the we going live with proxy or addressing and a request to pay. And so that's our focus right now, to put those in. But we have started thinking about exactly what Katrina was saying around the fintechs and that ecosystem of system operators, etc. And we've actually kicked off a stream right now to start engaging with them. And because I don't think we should always expect to innovate from the center. I think we create core capability in the center and we facilitate, but we need to allow the ecosystem to innovate around us. So that's why in terms of the solution we went to was very sort of platformish, open APIs, and kind of making sure that we can facilitate that ecosystem. So right now, Brad, I think the three that we're trying to go in with are our focus area, but we have definitely started thinking about acceptance and how do we solve two acceptance problems. You mentioned the two economies in South Africa. The one, how do we start dealing with the formal retail market? And I think Jenny referred to some of that and how they solved that. But then also, in the rural areas, a guy with a little, what we call spaza shops, which is a little shop in the middle of nowhere, how are they going to accept payments and deal with not only receiving payments, but paying for their next stock. And it's kind of a very fluid I live on the seat of my pants type of environment as fast as I sell, I buy. And we need to cater for those. So I think our next evolution is going to be really to spend time with those fintechs and allow that innovation. And how do we help them do that? And then we have to solve the acceptance issue in South Africa.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Martin. Look, we're into our final 5 minutes, so I might just ask each of you to provide just some final thoughts, just a minute or two. So Jenny, just sort of, just your reflections on the conversation we've had, and maybe any issues that we may not have covered in terms of the deployment of fast payment systems and their future going forward.
Oh, no, I've been really enjoying this discussion and heard so many wise things from my fellow panelists. So really interesting. And it's just stating the obvious that it's a really fun place to be right now in payments, because I think we will see a lot of things going forward. And I am so curious to see how this integrated payment experience is going to evolve in a couple of years, and how we solve the cross-border issue, as well as there's a lot of things also here in the Nordics, actually, when you come to recurring payments or direct debits and things that we need to solve. And we have a lot of transformation ahead of us, because we haven't started a journey from the old proprietary domestic systems to the new ones. So this will be a lot of things happening going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Martin, I might just ask you, any sort of final thoughts in terms of your deployment, or in terms of what you're seeing globally, and what you think, what the future holds in terms of fast payments?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I was thinking that we didn't probably touch on is the role of the regulator in these things. And I think sometimes we almost expect them to intervene, but I think support just in general is really important. I don't think it needs to be in the form of regulation, but just that support in the background. I think Jenny touched on it early on as well. I think the other thing that I'd really like to see is us solving the interoperability between faster payment solutions around the world ourselves as a community. And I think it'll be a far better outcome than somebody doing it to us, is if we solve it ourselves, or just ending up another version of what we have already around the world. So that would be kind of my wish for the future.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I might just go for the final thoughts to Katrina in terms of sort of your wish for the future, and where you see the sector going.
I certainly would echo Martin's comments about the regulator. I mean, I think they do have a really important role to play. And certainly we saw that here in Australia. We call it sort of gentle persuasion in terms of, how they've kind of encouraged the industry to get to where we are today. But I think it has very much been sort of a partnership in terms of really bringing it to life. I mean, I think, certainly here in Australia, I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to be so exciting in terms of what we're going to see from a kind of real-time payments perspective. And I think, we'll kind of look back in 5 years and say, really, we used to do that? It'll be like my kids when they see a landline phone and they go, what? How does that work? I don't understand.
Yeah.
It's going to be completely transformational. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you're right, Katrina. I think that it's only a matter of time before the world will completely change as a result of real time. I do think it is that transformational change. I think it's just a matter of us working through that and figuring out how to do that. So, look, thank you very much for all of my panelists. I'd like to thank all my panelists today, Martin, Katrina, and Jenny, for sharing your time and expertise today. It's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Across the globe, we've been able to use technology for this. So thank you very much for joining today. It's been a genuine thrill to have a conversation with all of you. Thanks again to everyone for your time and your interest. Please stay safe and enjoy the rest of the Payments Canada Summit 2022. Thank you very much.